another character defect is disregard for reproof. This is something that produces hate. When you turn to Proverbs 9, verses 8 through 9, in Proverbs 9, verses 8 through 9, it says, "Do not reprove a scoffer, lest he hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instructions to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in his learning." So here it is, just like Ecclesiastes says, there's not a righteous man who goes about and who does continually good, who doesn't slip once in a while. Here Proverbs is saying, sometime wise men need reproof. Sometime wise men make mistakes and need correction. And when you reprove a wise man, he's going to become wiser. And he's going to love you because he becomes wiser. But if you reprove a scoffer, then he's going to hate you. You know, it's and all of us probably can think of instances of where we've had to go to someone and to talk to them about something that they had done wrong, to correct them on something, and maybe it was just some little something that we needed to correct them on. And then it just seemed like that. What person was continually watching us, just watching for us to make a slip, so they could come back and say, "See there, you're not so smart, you're not so great, you slipped, you made a mistake." So when you reprove a scoffer, someone who doesn't have any regard for reproof, then they're going to hate you. And a person who is a scoffer, then they are someone who they produce hate, and they are someone who stirs up problems. Then we find that contentious people kindle strife. In Proverbs 26, verse 21, in Proverbs 26, verse 21, here it says, "Like charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife." You know, when we put charcoal on hot embers, then it just makes it burn hotter and longer. And when you add wood to a fire, it makes it burn hotter and longer. So it says that a contentious man, he kindles strife. You got a little bit of strife, then all you have to do is put a contentious man in the middle of it, and you have really got a gigantic big problem. And basically, when a person is a contentious individual, that means that they work against others instead of with them. If we are submissive, then we are working with others, but if we are contentious, then we are working against them. So contentious people kindle strife and create problems. They take little problems and turn them into gigantic mountains. Then another character defect is that of a meddler, that meddling promotes problems. Okay, in Proverbs 26, verse 17, here it says, "Like one who takes a dog by the ears is he who passes by and meddles with strife not belonging to him." You know, how many of us, when we go out for a walk and a dog comes out to greet us, grab a hold of that dog by its ears? I bet there's not anybody in here that's ever done that, because we know that we're going to get bit. Instead, we're saying, nice doggy, as we're trying to go on past him. Well, we know better than to grab a dog by the ears. And it says, by the same token, we ought to know that he who passes by and meddles with strife not belonging to him, he is just creating problems. He is just asking for problems. That there are some things that are simply none of our business, and we need to be careful that we don't meddle with the strife that doesn't belong to us. Notice that this word meddler means to cross over, and it's used widely in any transition. So it's crossing over from his business to somebody else's business. And I've put down here, this is codependency, what we've talked about in an earlier class, where we are trying to meddle in somebody else's business, trying to tell them what to do, trying to control what they do. I have a friend who comes to the Seattle area ever so often to visit her mother and other relatives. And she always goes home very frustrated and very fighting angry feelings toward her mother, because her mother just thinks she knows how everybody ought to do everything, and is continually saying, "Honey, you ought to do this. Honey, you ought to do that." And she says all Mother does is just make us all mad and frustrated at her, because she doesn't understand what's going on, and her solutions aren't really solutions to our problems. And so meddling in other people's business is something that creates problems. Then something else that creates problems is prejudice. In James 2, verses 1 through 4, and then 9, has quite a section here on prejudice and how that this is something that Christians should not be involved in. In James 2, verses 1 through 4, it says, "My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes, and say, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down by my footstool, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Then in verse 9 he says, but if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So if we have prejudice, and it really doesn't matter what kind of prejudice. Here it is, James, that is talking about prejudice toward a rich man and against a poor man. We may have racial prejudice of where our child maybe brings home a friend to play with of a different race, and we're prejudiced against that friend. So it may be racial prejudice, or it may be just all kinds of prejudice. Prejudice against men, prejudice against women. Many times you see prejudices against men and against women in marriages, and it causes problems in those marriages of where they're looking at, well, that's just like a man to do something like that. Or women drivers, that's just like a woman. I knew that was a woman in that car up there by the way she was driving. All of these prejudices, they cause problems. They create strife. Then another one is impatience. Impatience makes a person sensitive. In Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 3, in Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 3, it says, he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, entreat you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness and patience, showing forbearance to one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So one thing that promotes peace is patience and showing forbearance to one another in love. And this word love here comes from the Greek word agapeo, which is in 1 Corinthians 13, acting in another person's best interest. So if we're going to be acting in another person's best interest, if we're going to be promoting peace, then we need to be a patient individual. Because impatience is something that makes us sensitive. Then let's turn over to Colossians 3, verses 12 through 14. In Colossians 3, verses 12 through 14. And here it says, and so, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. So if we want to avoid problems, then we need to be a patient individual and realize that impatience is something that makes us very sensitive. Several years ago, when I was traveling out of town, there was a family that met me at the airport, and we had to drive for several hours to get to where we were going. And the lady in the car was so irritable and so grumpy, and I was so tired from that trip that I just literally wished I could just jump out of that car because it was so unpleasant just listening to her irritableness with her family. And so later when we got to where we were going and I had a chance to talk to her privately, I told her, I said, on the trip over here, you were just so irritable. I said, I just wanted to jump out of the car. I said, what's the problem? And so then she began to tell me about something her husband had done a couple of days earlier. Seems that her husband and her son had taken her to the mall to go shopping. And while they were there, it had gotten to be dinner time. And so her husband says, let's go over here to this nice restaurant and get a steak. And she says, but my son and I just wanted a hamburger so we could keep shopping. But he just had his mind made up. He wanted that big juicy steak, and he just had his mind made up, and so that's what we did. We went and ate that steak, and it took up all of our time, and we didn't have any more time to shop. I said, well, did you tell him that you wanted a hamburger? And she says, no. I said, well, what do you think he is, a mind reader? And she says, that's what he asked me when he finally wanted to know what I was mad about. What do you think I am, a mind reader? And so they'd had this problem. But this wasn't the end of it. She's just irritable. And so as we continued to talk about, why are you so irritable? What's making you so irritable? And what came out was that she felt like her life was out of control. She didn't feel like she had control of her life. She wasn't accomplishing the goals she wanted. And she was very frustrated with herself. And so I asked her, I said, do you think that's right to take that out on your husband and your son just because you're unhappy with yourselves? You need to start doing the things you want to do and the things you know that you need to do. Get control of your life and don't be so irritable and so unpleasant to be around. So she thought about it and she decided that that was what she would do. But first she had to smooth things over with her son and her husband. So what she did was she took a paper sack like you buy groceries in, and she wrote "I love you" across it and put it upstairs in her son's bedroom so that when he'd come along he'd see this note and signed it. So her son came down for breakfast the next morning. He says, and all he said was, "Mom, I got your note." So he appreciated that. And so then while her husband and her son were there at the breakfast table, she told them, she says, "I have really been irritable and grouchy lately, and I want you to know that I'm not going to be irritable anymore." And she said her husband turned to her son and he said, "Have you noticed Mother being irritable?" And then they both laughed like that was the best joke they'd ever heard. And so then she knew that she was forgiven, and she went ahead and did the things with her life that she knew she should be doing and quit taking her frustration with herself out on her husband and her son. Okay, then as we continue to think about personality flaws, another very obvious one is that hot-tempered people abound in transgression. And let's turn over to Proverbs 29, verse 22. Proverbs 29, verse 22. And here it says, "An angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression." Okay, here it is. We have our angry and hot-tempered individuals to see the difference in these two words. Okay, angry, the word angry means anger from the dilation of the nostrils and is the most widely used of the 6 words for anger. So when you're reading Proverbs and you see anger, it's meaning anger, and you can just imagine somebody just getting so mad that their nostrils are flaring. So this is what this word means. Then hot-tempered or furious, I think the King James says, is one of the strongest words for anger, and it refers to a burning and consuming wrath. When a person is just consumed with burning wrath, you can picture his face all red. You can picture the blood vessels in his face sticking out because he is just consumed with this anger and wrath. Now notice what it says. It says an angry man who just has normal anger, then he stirs up strife. A person who can't control their temper, then they are going to be creating problems. They're going to be creating strife. But if you've got a hot-tempered man, a man who is just consumed with his anger, then he abounds in transgression. He can commit more sins in just a few minutes than he can spend an hour apologizing for it, in an hour taking care of it. It may take years to get over some of the things that have been said in the heat of his anger. Or women do this too. A woman can have this type of temper too. But a hot-tempered person, then he just abounds in transgressions. Then in Proverbs 22, verses 24 through 25. Okay, Proverbs 22, verses 24 through 25. It says, "Do not associate with a man given to anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, lest you learn his ways and find a snare for yourself." So here it is. He says that reacting angrily or having a hot temper is a learned reaction, and to not associate with people like this, lest you learn his ways. And when I've had opportunity to counsel and to talk to people who have a problem with temper, I always ask them, was your father or your mother given to temper? Did they have a hot temper? And I have yet to find an individual who's given to having a hot temper who has said, "No, I'm the first angry person in my family." That there's always some anger in that family. There was one woman that I was talking to who had a very bad problem with temper. And when she finally came to talk to me about it, the reason she did was because she says, "I have this 4-year-old son," and she says he is sweet and lovable, and he's just really the neatest little kid. But she says, "I'm starting to see him develop a temper like I have, and so I want to learn how to control my temper so that I won't be a bad influence on him." So I asked her, I said, were either of your parents have a hot temper? And she says, "Yes, my dad did." So it was something that she learned from her dad. The other day I was reading an article that was talking about physical violence, and it says there are women who batter their husbands, who are engaged in physical violence, but it says in nearly every one of these cases, these women grew up in a home where they saw their dad and lived with a dad who had a hot temper. So even women learn to have a hot temper from their father. So this is something that is contagious. It's something that is passed on, and he says do not associate with such a person because his temper is going to rub off on you. Of course, a hot-tempered person, then he's somebody, you can see him. He's driving down the freeway. You know, when you're driving down the freeway, you don't have any control over the traffic lights, when they turn red, when they turn yellow, when they turn green. But yet a hot-tempered person is angry at things at which he has no control. Angry at other drivers. And so if a man cannot control his temper behind the wheel, over things that really are little compared to the other things in life, then this is generally a person who has a hot temper. So these are all personality characteristics that are defects that cause a person to have problems. Okay, what we want to do now is we want to learn how to make a mountain out of a molehill. How to take a little bitty problem and how to really make a giant problem out of it. So we want to see a formula as how people generally react to problems. Instead of solving problems, they simply react to them. In Proverbs 16, verse 25, here it says, "There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." So when you have problems, the person in the midst of the problems, he can look at it and there's a way that seems right to him, but instead of solving his problem, it's going to be the way of death. Notice that the way means a course of life or a mode of action. So there is a course of life or a mode of action that seems right to him. Right means straight, convenient, just, equity, pleasant, prosperous. So he thinks if he follows this course of life, this mode of action, then he's going to have a prosperous life, he's going to have a pleasant life, life is going to be everything that it should be. But instead, what he's going to find is death. And death means death naturally or a violent death. And then figuratively, it's used to mean pestilence or ruin. So figuratively, he follows this course of life. It may cost him his death if he's headed towards a violent type of argument where he's getting involved in physical abuse, and it may be his physical death, or it just may be the ruin of a beautiful relationship that he's had with this woman that he's married. So when we look at problems, that there is a way that seems common to man, seems right, and that's what we want to look at. We want to look at the ways that seem right to a man. But first of all, we want to think about, as we think about this relationship, we want to think about that we'll be talking about the death of a marriage. Here's a young couple getting married, and the preacher is saying, "Do you promise to love, honor, and obey till divorce do you part?" So we're going to learn how it is that couples end up in divorces by not solving their problems properly. Basically, what we find is that all problems always start out small, always little, with just a minor irritation. Let's turn over to Proverbs 17, verse 14, and notice this about problems. In Proverbs 17, verse 14, it says, "The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so abandon the quarrel before it breaks out." So he says strife, it begins as just like letting out just a little trickle of water. So that's the way it begins. So you abandon the quarrel. You stop the fight. You stop the quarrel before it breaks out, before this little trickle of water turns into a flood. And so, of course, we know that all great rivers start out as little teeny tiny streams. So that's the idea. All problems start out little. Notice that strife just means a contest or a quarrel, some kind of discord in the family, brawl and contention. Leave it alone means properly to opound, to smite, to reject, to let it alone. The quarrel or the contention that you're to let alone means a contest, a grapple, a wrangle, to hold a controversy. Before it breaks out, it means, or meddled with, is what the King James says, means to be obstinate, meddle. And so when it breaks out, you think about an obstinate person, you can't control them, you can't stop them. Once it gets to this point, then you cannot stop it. Then in Proverbs 17, verse 9, another general principle. Here it says, "He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends." So he who covers a transgression, that there are some things that we need to realize that we just going to have to overlook, not be a touchy person like we started off talking about. And when we're covering up things that are insignificant, realizing that other people make mistakes just like we make mistakes, then we're seeking love. We're seeking an affectionate relationship with others. And I believe that the Septuagint translates, which is our Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, translates this word love with the word phileo, which means affection. If you want affection, if you want tender feelings, then you're going to have to cover certain transgression. But he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. So he who takes a thing and makes a big thing out of it and harps upon it, then he separates intimate friends. And then, of course, the marriage relationship is a very intimate friendship. So we have down here just a little saying, it was an oversight on the other person's part, so you overlook it. It was done through forgetfulness on the other person's part, so you forget it. It made nothing of you. It wasn't a reflection on you, so you make nothing of it. So just a little saying about how to avoid quarrels. So basically, all arguments start out little, and they need to be handled when they are little. However, if the person does not handle them while they are little, then what happens to that person is that person always becomes deceitful. Because if we do not deal with problems when they are little, teeny tiny, we have to become deceitful in order to survive. In Proverbs 26, verses 23 through 28, in Proverbs 26, verses 23 through 28, it says, like an earthen vessel overlaid with silver dross are burning lips and a wicked heart. He who hates disguises it with his lips, but he lays up deceit in his heart. When he speaks graciously, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred covered itself with guile, his wickedness will be revealed before the assembly. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him. A lying tongue hates those it crushes, and a flattering mouth works ruin. So here it is, a woman, she gets upset about something, and her husband asks her what's wrong, and so she becomes deceitful. She says, oh, nothing. Or, I didn't sleep good last night, I just don't feel good. Or she says something to take him away from the issue and to pretend that there really is not a problem there. She becomes deceitful. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18, Proverbs 10:18, it says, he who conceals hatred has lying lips, and he who spreads slander is a fool. So if we conceal that we have a problem and that we're unhappy about something, then we have lying lips. And then he who spreads slander is a fool. Then again in Proverbs 27, verse 6, Proverbs 27, verse 6 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. So here it is, a true friend will tell you when there is a problem, and you may be wounded by that, but faithful are their wounds. They're looking out for your best interest when they talk to you about problems. But he says, but deceitful are the wounds or the kisses of an enemy. Here it is, someone that's always kissing you and pretending that they love you and that they like you and that there's no problem. Then he says, that's deceitful. That's something that you cannot depend upon. Then in Proverbs 16, verse 6, in Proverbs 16, verse 6, he says, by loving kindness and truth, iniquity is atoned for, and by the fear of the Lord, one keeps away from evil. So, if we take care of a problem when it's little, teeny, tiny, it's real easy to have loving kindness in the tone of our voice and in the words that we choose. And so it's easy for us to atone for problems with loving kindness when we take care of it when it's just a little, teeny, tiny problem. But if we allow a problem to grow, then the tone of our voice is going to change, the look on our face is going to change, the words that we choose to talk to that person about is going to change. So if we do not solve the problem when it is little tiny, then we are going to become a deceitful person. My dad told a story. My dad's a farmer. He told a story about how one time he was working in the field with a man, and this man's wife came up to where this man and my dad were working, and she was so angry. She says, somebody left the gate open and all the cows got out. Do you know who left that gate open? Because now I've got to go round all the cows up. And so this fella told his wife, he says, well, JT was through here earlier this morning. And his wife says, that just sounds just like JT to leave that gate open. I am so angry at JT. And so she went off to get the cows, mad at JT. And then the farmer turned to my dad and he said, I really left the gate open this morning, but there's no way in the world I'm going to tell her that I left the gate open. And he says, but JT really was through here this morning. So what he did was he told her something that was true to help her draw a false conclusion to get him off the hook. And so this is deceit. And so a lot of times people do. They cover up a problem by telling their husband something that is true, or the husband tells his wife something that is true. Here it is. He thinks she's mad. He thinks she's got a problem, and she covers it up and doesn't let him know what it is so that he can deal with it. Once they become deceitful, the next step is they become very vulnerable and easily offended. In Proverbs 18, verse 19, it says, A brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city, and contentions are like the bars of a castle. You know, once we become offended and we don't take care of it, then we're very vulnerable and we're easily offended. It doesn't matter what that person does, then we're going to be easy to be offended. Everything he does, we're going to be reading something wrong into it. We're going to be seeing something wrong in it. So once someone gets offended and they don't take care of it, well, then you might as well go lay siege against a castle and try to overthrow a castle as to try to win that person. Or you might as well go down into a dungeon and live in a prison cell and to try to break out of it as to try to deal with a person who is offended. So once a person becomes vulnerable and easily offended, then everything that is happening to them is bad. Then they overreact to simple irritations. Because they haven't dealt with the real problem, they're super sensitive, and then they begin to overreact. Let's turn to James 1, verses 13 through 20. James 1, verses 13 through 20. Okay, here it says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. For each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. And when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." So here it is, when we have our own lust. Of course, lust just means a strong desire, and lust does not have within it the idea of anything bad. It can be a strong desire for something that is good in itself, but yet the way we are desiring it is not right. So here it is, he says, we are carried away by our strong desires, and when this is conceived, then it gives birth to sin, the sin grows. In verse 16 he says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the exercise of his will he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we might be, as it were, the firstfruits among his creatures. This you know, my beloved brethren, but let every one be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." So one way we avoid problems is that we are quick to hear what God says, quick to hear what the other person says, slow to anger, have our anger under control, or slow to speak, to speak and to jump someone out or to criticize them, and then slow to anger, slow to feel anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. So when we have our lusts and our wants, then it gives way to sin, and it grows, and it causes us to be where we overreact to simple irritations. You hear women say something has happened that has made them unhappy. They decided for some reason their feelings maybe are too hurt to tell their husband, so they pretend nothing is wrong. Or maybe their feelings, that's not the reason. They don't tell their husband because they think, he just ought to know. He just ought to know how I feel. He ought to know what I want. And so they expect him to be a mind reader. And then they become vulnerable. They overreact to simple irritations, and then they start assuming, you don't love me, or you don't care. You don't appreciate me. This is something many times men think. I work all the time for her, and she just doesn't appreciate me. Then they use you never or you always. Of course, these are words that are overreactions that are causing problems in the marriage. Then as we continue to think about how problems grow and how it is that women become deceitful, many times they're like this lady. They're the martyr. They're calm, cool, and collected on the outside, but they're just full of anger. They're just seething with anger and resentment because they are not dealing with their problems when they're little. Instead, they're playing the role of the martyr. Then, as the person continues and the problem continues to grow, what happens next is that the person begins to judge motives. Of course, we've been talking a lot about judging motives in 1 Corinthians 2 verses 11 and in 1 Corinthians 4 verse 5, that no man knows the thoughts of another man except that man tells him. But if they're not dealing with the problem when it's little and getting it out into the open, then it's just natural that they're going to begin to judge motives and try to figure out why he did this. He did this because he doesn't care, or he did this because that's the way his mother brought him up, or he's just like his dad. Different kinds of motives that they will give to him. Then, as they begin to judge motives, the natural reaction is that resentfulness and bitterness begin to grow. In Hebrews 12, verse 15, it's a verse that we have seen before, talking about the bitterness and the effect of bitterness. In Hebrews 12, verse 15, it says, See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by it many be defiled. And we've talked about how that bitterness is like a poisonous plant. It's a root that grows up, it springs up, it causes trouble, and by it many are defiled. And we've talked about how that this word defiled means like to dip or dye. Like you just take somebody and dip them down in some dye and they completely change their color. When a person becomes bitter, they are changed. They are no longer the same person. They can no longer see things accurately, and the problem begins to grow and to get worse. Then as it continues to grow and to get worse, then the next thing they do is they blame others and they blame things for their problems instead of dealing with the problem that was originally there. Let's turn over to Proverbs 16, verse 2. And notice this characteristic in Proverbs 16, verse 2. Here he says, all the ways of a man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs the motives. So here it is, everything that a person does, he says that's clean, that's right. He thinks his motives are good, but God knows the truth. God knows whether they really are or not. So it's natural to mankind to blame someone else instead of accepting blame for himself. In Genesis 3, verses 12 through 13 is a verse we've looked at before, and you're familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam tried to blame Eve for his sin, yet God would not allow him to do it. Eve tried to blame the serpent for her sin, yet God would not allow her to do it. That God holds everyone responsible for their own actions. But if a person is not dealing with their problems while they're little, then those problems are going to grow, they're going to become sensitive, they're going to judge motives, resentfulness and bitterness is going to grow, then they are going to blame others, and they're going to blame other things for their problems. And of course it's easier to blame others, and it's easy to blame other things if we're not dealing with the problem. That takes the pressure off of us to go ahead and to deal with the problem, with the person that we have that problem with. Here's the Lockhorns. She's there reading the paper, and she tells her husband, she says, I don't say you're always wrong. I'm not one to dwell on the obvious. So here it is. She's a master at blaming her husband for the problems that they have. So no need to tell him he's always wrong. Of course, this is an example of pride. Then, after a person gets down to this point, the next thing that is going to happen is that they are going to start a chain reaction war. And back to James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Of course, we're spending a lot of time in James, so that may be a chapter that you may want to later to go home and to spend some time reading and thinking about. In James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, it says, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? So that's what we're asking. Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be an enemy of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Okay, so here it is. He's talking about their fights, that they commit murder, have quarrels, all kinds of problems. And so this is a chain reaction war that we're seeing here. Let's turn over to Proverbs 30, verses 11 through 14. Proverbs 30, verses 11 through 14. And here it says, there is a kind of man who curses his father and does not bless his mother. There is a kind who is pure in his own eyes, yet is not washed from his filthiness. There is a kind, oh how lofty are his eyes, and his eyelids are raised in arrogance. There is a kind of man whose teeth are like swords, and his jaw teeth like knives, to devour the afflicted from the earth and the needy from among men. So you notice this description of a man here. He's got all kinds of problems. He has no respect for his father or mother. He curses his father. He doesn't bless his mother. He's pure in his own sight. He blames other people. Nothing he does is wrong. Yet he's involved in all kinds of filthiness and wickedness. And he says how lofty are his eyes. He's filled with pride, and his eyelids are raised in arrogance. And there's a man whose teeth are like swords, and his jaw teeth are like knives. Boy, the things that come out of his mouth, they just cut people to shreds and just do all kinds of damage to other people. And there he is. He's there to devour the afflicted from the earth and the needy from among men. Now, when we get down to this stage, to this chain reaction war, this is when the couple are no longer acting like adults. They are acting like children, like babies. And of course, if we have children, we know how children and babies act, how they fuss and fight and carry on, and the rivalry and the jealousy and the pride and the friction that goes on among them. They're not solving their problems in an intelligent manner. They are just simply reacting to problems and making their problem worse. Now, there are several forms that this chain reaction war can take. One is it just may simply turn into a quarrel where they are quarreling, fussing, and fighting verbally with each other. In Proverbs 12, verse 18, Proverbs 12, verse 18, okay, here he says, "There is one who speaks rashly like the thrust of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." So some people, their tongue is just like a sword, just cutting you to ribbons, cutting you to shreds with the things that they say, but yet the wise, what they have to say is healing. In Proverbs 15, verse 28, Proverbs 15, verse 28, it says, "The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things." So the righteous person, he stops and thinks before he speaks. But the wicked person, what is the first thing and ugliest thing that comes to his mind, and that he just pours it out and he's just ready to say it. Then in Proverbs 18, verse 21, Proverbs 18, verse 21, he says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit." So the tongue has with it the power of life and death. You know, husbands and wives can say some of the ugliest, most hurtful things to each other, things that can just destroy their relationship because they don't stop and think about the effect that it's going to have on each other, and because they may be saying things in the heat of anger. I have a picture up here that shows a husband and wife who are involved in quarrels. Here it is, he's complaining because she can't match his socks, and she's complaining because he's never on time. They're both just constantly at each other, constantly complaining and fussing at each other. And this is what we would call a chain reaction war of where they are involved in quarrels. Then another type of chain reaction war is that of ridicule. And when we turn over to ridicule, we want to see this in Proverbs 26, verses 18 through 29. Proverbs 26, 18 through 19, It says, "Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death, so is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, 'Was I not joking?'" Now this idea here of a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death, they didn't live in the age that we do, where men go in. You remember several years ago how men broke in, or didn't break in, but they went into a McDonald's and just randomly killed people. Well, they didn't have guns back then, or some of the people, snipers at schoolyards and this sort of thing. This is the kind of man it's talking about. What he is, he's a madman, and he throws what he has. He has firebrands, arrows, and death. Someone who's mad and just randomly going out and slaughtering and killing people. Then just like that man, so is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, "Was I not joking?" So a lot of times people, as we talked about earlier, they use humor to disguise the evil way that they're treating someone. If someone calls their hand on it, "Well, honey, you're just too sensitive. I was only teasing you. I'm only joking." And so ridicule is a very effective way to have a chain reaction war. And many times you've got both the husband and the wife caught up in ridicule. Everything they say to the other is to tear them down, to ridicule them. And so it is a war. Then in Proverbs 29, verse 9, it says, "When a wise man has a controversy with a foolish man, the foolish man either rages or laughs, and there is no rest." So when a wise man has a problem with someone who is a fool, then that fool, instead of correcting his behavior and loving that person for correcting them, he either gets very angry or he laughs. He ridicules and he makes fun of them. So ridicule is an effective way to have a chain reaction war. Now, another way that couples have chain reaction wars is that they just harden themselves, or maybe one of them hardens himself and makes themselves emotionally unavailable to the other person. In Proverbs 21, verse 29, it says, "A wicked man shows a bold," or a hardeneth, is what the King James says, face. And then it says, but as for the upright, he makes his way sure. So the wicked man shows a bold face. And this word bold or hardened is different from the word that we saw earlier. And it means to be stout, literally or figuratively, to harden, impudent, prevail, strengthen self, to be strong. Many times if husbands and wives are having problems and they're too nice to get into quarrels, verbal fights, and they're too nice to ridicule, then what they do is they give in to hardening themselves, to building up a wall. Okay, you've hurt me. There's no way I'm going to allow you to hurt me again. So they build this wall around themselves to protect themselves from hurt. And so essentially what they do is that they divorce each other emotionally. They are continuing to live in the same house, but he goes his way, she goes her way, and this is a type of chain reaction war. And so what it is, as we see the picture here, is what they're doing is one of them or both of them is giving the other one the cold shoulder, and this is their way of trying to deal with their problems rather than solving their problems when they are little. Then the fourth type of chain reaction war that people get into is murder. They're in James 4 verses 1 through 2 that we just read a little while ago. When people start using physical violence against their mate, then the statistics show that that there is a very good chance that physical violence is eventually going to turn into murder. So God recognizes this aspect of murder when people are not solving their problems, when they're not having the right attitude toward other people. As we've talked about before, 75% of murders are committed by a family member. 53% of those murders are committed by men. 47% are committed by women. However, most of the murders that the women commit are committed in self-defense. Yet here is a chain reaction war that has driven a woman to murder her husband. So these are chain reaction wars that people get involved in simply because they don't solve their problems when they are little teeny tiny and when it is easy to take care of them. Then, when the person gets in the middle of these chain reaction wars, whether they're just holding everything in and they're hardening themselves, or whether they're having quarrels, or whether they're arguing, or being ridiculing the other one, or actually slugging it out, then that person needs to seek some comfort from others in order to appease their conscience, to keep them feeling good about themselves, that they're right, to continue to help them blame their husband. Turn to Proverbs 12, verse 15. Proverbs 12, verse 15 says, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel." So here it is. Even if you take a fool, we've already defined it as someone who is wicked and vile, who is obstinate, who is stubborn. Even this individual believes that everything he does is right in his own eyes. So if you take this wicked, stubborn person and he believes that everything he does is right, then how about the woman who is just simply refusing to have sex with her husband because he's ignoring her emotional needs? Why, that's right in her eyes, because after all, look at what he's doing. So she feels that what she's doing is justified and doesn't feel blamed for that. And her husband, he comes home and he sees that she's giving him the cold shoulder. And so he feels like it's all right for him to perhaps be a workaholic and to neglect her needs, because after all, she's neglecting his needs. So if a fool can feel good and that his actions are right, then other people, it's very easy for them to feel right about their attitudes or the things that they're doing. Then in Proverbs 15, verse 2, or not 2, verse 12, Proverbs 15, verse 12, it says, "A scoffer does not love one who reproves him. He will not go to the wise." So you take someone who is ridiculing, someone who's involved in sin, someone who is scoffing is what is right. It says that he does not love the wise. He's not going to go to someone who will correct him. He's not going to go to the wise. So instead, when these people seek comfort from others, then they seek someone who is going to sympathize with them, someone who is going to make them feel good about what they're doing. And invariably, these people go to the weakest and the people with the least amount of knowledge to sympathize with them. They go to these people and lay out their problems. Here's my problems. Isn't my husband really a rat? And isn't he really unsympathetic, cold, and unloving to me? So they go to someone who will help them rationalize. You notice I have up here what rationalization is. That to rationalize is simply to tell a ration of lies, where they are lying to themselves, making themselves believe something that is not right. So when they go to this person who's unable to help them, someone who can simply sympathize with them, and something that I have noticed is that invariably women who are involved in wife abuse, whose husbands are abusing them, these women, I don't know how it is, but somehow they have a sixth